Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this session. This is the Access Agile Festival. My name is Andrea Pratt-Smith, and I am the Access Agile Festival Ambassador for the Bahamas. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mr. John Michael Clarke, who will be presenting today on Agile and Disaster Management. John Michael Clarke is the Bahamas' most renowned and accomplished project manager. He is a chartered fellow, QS, project manager, professor, and arbitrator. His work can be seen on every major island in the Bahamas, and through his leadership, he has developed an impressive project management portfolio and has led his company, Veritas Consultants Limited, to a point where its participation in projects is known to positively impact the built environment in the Bahamas. In the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian in 2019, the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas appointed John Michael Clarke, co-chairman of the Disaster Recovery and Reconstruction Committee, to provide critical project management guidance for recovery efforts. He has subsequently been appointed as a non-executive chairman of the newly formed Disaster Reconstruction Authority. This authority is responsible for reconstruction efforts in disaster zones of Abaco and Grand Bahama. Please welcome our speaker for this event, Mr. John Michael Clarke.
Let me share my screen. Okay. So we're going to talk this morning about Agile and disaster management. And as all of you know, back in September 2019, the Bahamas was hit with Hurricane Dorian. And Hurricane Dorian was a Category 5 storm with winds of between 185 to 220 miles per hour. We had rainfall between 12 and 15 inches. There's a storm surge between 18 and 23 feet. And this storm was the most significant hurricane event in a generation. And this impacted the Northwest Bahamas, the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama for 68 hours. The southern eye wall, and if you know anything about hurricanes, the eye wall is where the winds and hurricane conditions are most intense, stood stationary over Grand Bahama for 30 hours, more than a day. And Abaco, the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama, they represent two significant revenue centers for the Bahamian economy, and they were totally obliterated. We had to evacuate more than 5,000 persons, and we accounted for approximately 80 persons as confirmed dead. But there were 300 persons missing, and the estimated physical and economic loss was estimated to be $3 billion. So I'm sitting at my desk September 4th, 2019, and I get a call from the cabinet of the Bahamas to find myself at NEMA to assist with coordinating a national response. And to give you some background, some of my background, I am a straight up predictive life cycle waterfall guy up until this hurricane event. And what that meant is that a part of managing and coordinating the response is on the local level, dealing with government agencies, the Ministry of Works, the agencies that provide physical infrastructure and social services, dealing with local NGOs, non-governmental organizations that were interested in providing aid to those impacted. And of course, you can imagine, given the gravity and the extent of the damage, I mean, this went worldwide. There were a number of international partners, governments, international response agencies military partners, humanitarian aid personnel, and international NGOs that wanted to come into the Bahamas and assist. And all of these persons had to be properly coordinated. Generally, in the Bahamas, because we are so vulnerable, there is a pattern. And our general preparation, and this happens every year, there's a collation of national policies and procedures, things that we do in emergency. There's a training for disaster managers. There's training for responders. And these activities, these happen by statute. That means that there is a law in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas that actually says that these things must happen. And these events are coordinated through the National Emergency Management Agency, and that's called NEMA. And generally what NEMA does is when we have storm events, they are the ones who are responsible for setting up the Emergency Operations Command Center. They are the ones that are responsible for developing the emergency support functions, and I will describe those in a few minutes. They're the ones that provide the emergency managers and train emergency managers. And the way that that's done is they draw on managers from existing government agencies and NGOs, local NGOs, to assist in the management of a disaster response. In the Bahamas, we use a model of 14 emergency support functions. So during a storm, and this is for every storm, NEMA, by statute, coordinates these emergency support functions. And those emergency support functions, there are 14, and these don't change. And this, I will tell you, is from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. This is actually a model developed by FEMA in the United States, and we've adapted it for the Bahamas. So FEMA uses the same model. Their ESFs may be the same or similar, depending on how they set up their response. So you have ESF 1 that is responsible for all of the transportation needs, 2 communications, 3 public works, all the way down to 14, down to animal care and safety. So what happens in a storm if there are peculiar activities to any one of these areas? You have a focus group of persons that deal with that area. So if, for example, there's a communication outage, persons in ESF 2 takes care of it. If there is some infrastructure damage, ESF 3 will take care of it. So the whole idea is that there is a way to coordinate the significant impacts of a storm event through these 14 ESF. So as a part of the postmortem, I've had some time to think, me being an old waterfall guy, what happened? And if I were to put the response to Hurricane Dorian into a project management lifecycle framework, how would I best describe it? Well, of course, we can't say that it is predictive because every disaster response is unpredictable. There are too many unknowns. And these unknowns, these unknowns don't often satisfy the needs for the multiple response outcomes. No 2 hurricanes are alike. The Bahamas has been hit with 9 hurricanes in the last 15 years. 9 named storms have passed through, and no 2 storms are alike. Is it iterative? Well, Not exactly, because disaster response outcomes can be unknown. And sometimes saying that the response is absolutely complete, that varies. So to say that it's iterative, it's not ideal. Is it incremental? Well, usually in an incremental life cycle, there's speed focus. But what we've learned in a disaster environment and in the immediate aftermath of the storm, even though speed is essential, sometimes things take time. Recently, there was a building that fell in Florida, and we realized there that you can go as fast as you want, but because of the nature of the disaster, sometimes things take time. In an agile environment, and this is what happened every day. This combines the iterative and incremental characteristics. Teams require early feedback and customer visibility and control of the product. So in a disaster environment, the product is an apt and adequate response. And there are frequent small deliveries that are needed, and customer value is given via frequent deliveries and feedback. And what this means is in a disaster environment, communication is key. I showed you that graphic a few minutes ago with the 14 ESFs. Everyone is decked with a phone and a satellite radio, and on the ground, you are getting constant feedback. To put it in project management lingo, the product owner of every disaster is the government. In our scenario, the product owner was the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas and the citizens in the impacted areas. Our cross-functional team members, these were the disaster management managers, government agencies, local and international NGOs, and international security forces. And the team facilitator was the National Emergency Operations Center manager. So if you look at the response players, you will see that they fit into the lingo of an agile team. So out of the textbook, what is required for a successful agile response? Servant leadership, dedicated team, cross-functional team, specialists and generalists, and ability to manage in any location. How did that fit with our Hurricane Dorian scenario? Well, NEMA, being a lead government agency, NEMA provided for us the servant leadership. NEMA spends an awful amount of time training and coordinating and facilitating the response for a response. The hurricane season in the Atlantic goes from June 1st through to November 30th every year. And what NEMA does is through its agency partners. So the Bahamas has a parliamentary democracy based on the Westminster system, similar to how it is in the UK. So we have ministries instead of departments, and our ministry heads are called ministers instead of secretaries, as they are in the United States. And each one of those ministries provide a manager to NEMA to train. And NEMA does specific training with each one of them. And those managers are actually dedicated to emergency management strategy. So for example, in the Bahamas, the Ministry of Works is responsible for all infrastructure installations throughout the country. They have on their staff dedicated persons to serve in the event of an emergency response. Along with the servant leadership that is provided by NEMA and the dedicated team members, there are also cross-functional team members. We have in the Bahamas specified training for our Royal Bahamas Defense Force, our police force, and they are trained so they can come in and provide and execute a multiple number of functions in a disaster zone, apart from providing security. Some of them provide humanitarian aid. They assist with humanitarian aid. They assist with engineering. They assist the Ministry of Works with infrastructure response. So those are part of our cross-functional team members. And then, of course, we have specialists and generalists. And these persons consist of the global cadre of disaster management specialists and volunteers that come from all around the world to assist in providing an appropriate response to an emergency or disaster event. So here again, you have all of the Agile Agreement ingredients that make up an adequate response to a disaster management event. So in Hurricane Dorian, what happened in 2019? Well, in June of 2019, NEMA did what it always does every single year. It compiled the emergency policies, procedures. It reviewed its standard operations. And this happened as early as February in 2019. It had its Emergency Operation Center management training. And it set about organizing its emergency support functions teams. It reviewed those roles and responsibilities, and every year, NEMA has event simulation based on the most recent events. Hurricane Dorian passed in 2019, and the simulation for Hurricane Dorian was based on two previous storms, one in 2017, which was Hurricane Irma, and one in 2016, which was Hurricane Matthew. Hurricane Irma was a Category 2, Matthew was a Category 3. Both of those passed through the Bahamas within 5 years of Dorian. So early in 2019, NEMA actually conducted event simulations based on those previous storms. And then NEMA tests its mobilization. So, for example, in a given week, NEMA actually went through a 4 or 5 day period as if a storm was approaching, and they were timing how quickly they can set up the EOC, the Operations Command Center, how quickly they could mobilize the emergency support functions, and more importantly, how quickly they can mobilize the communication systems. These processes and the processes for the preparation, all of these, these are finite. So you can use predictive project management to test and to prepare. And then we had the event. Hurricane Dorian, the imminent threat was recognized around the 26th, 27th of August. The EOC was immediately activated, and it was fully staffed by the 30th of August 2019. That means all of the emergency managers were there. It was confirmed that the communication networks was launched. So all of the persons on the ground that needed satellite phones and the communication information, all of that was set in place. And then persons that were charged with giving real-time event data, those persons were set in place as well. As the storm was passing, as far as was possible, we were collecting data in real time. So on the islands, the emergency managers on the islands, they were able to communicate with the EOC in New Providence, the capital, letting us know what is happening as far as was possible on the ground. Now, Dorian was so significant and so slow. I will tell you that on both islands, for a time, there was total communication silence. And that was perhaps the most terrifying because we had never experienced that in recent times. So for about 6 hours, we could not communicate. And then we were relying on some technology tools, aircraft, seacraft as far as possible, and satellite imagery, pretty much to tell us where the storm was. While this event was happening, we were preparing rapid response teams. Who would go out first at the all clear? Where would they go? What was the, what data they would be collecting? And we were preparing rescue and recovery teams because we were getting word back relative to the level of storm surge. And based on that, we expected significant impact, and we expected the need, because in category 3 with Hurricane Matthew, we had a significant search and recovery effort in Grand Bahama in particular. We expected Dorian being a more significant storm to have pretty much the same. And then we prepared for the first responders. These islands are very close. So what happened was Hurricane Dorian passed over Abaco, went over Grand Bahama, and stopped. And because it stayed stationary, we were unable to go to Abaco because the sea swells were still impacting that island. So all of this activity was being coordinated in real time by NEMA. So after the meteorological all clear, and what this means is that the impacted islands are no longer experiencing severe effects, and you can send out teams to respond. What happened? Rescue and recovery teams were immediately mobilized. And as far as possible, these are supposed to go out once the all clear is given. But in real time, as long as it's reasonably safe, rescue and recovery starts. The rapid response team was immediately mobilized to survey impacted areas, and storm data was collected. And because we had lost communication, we had to reestablish the communication network on both islands. And by this time, we were able to fly over with aircraft. We were able to get better satellite imagery, and our seacraft was able to tell us exactly what level of environmental and ocean damage had taken place. And based on that data, we started to think about how relief and evacuation networks would be mobilized, the type and level of emergency and humanitarian aid how those would be sent to the impacted areas. And within 48 hours of the all clear, we needed that rapid response report so that we can adequately plan and so that the ESFs would be better informed on how they ought to respond and what the priority and critical needs were in the disaster zone. And this set of first data became the user requirements. Now, I'm a big mind mapper. I'm not a linear person. So when they came back from out in the field and told me what was going on, this is what I did. And this particular data informed our response. What needed to happen immediately, what needs to happen in the first 3 to 6 months, what would be happening in 2 to 5 years. And based on this, in an agile sense, we developed a set of deliverables for us to launch an adequate response to Hurricane Dorian. And essentially, this became the framework for our backlog. Out of this, we were able to prioritize how we would respond. And it actually gave us particular focus. Okay, so within the first 2 weeks, we focused on the stuff in black. We know that if we have 3 to 6 months, the stuff in purple, and this gave us particular and acute focus. This essentially became the Bible for the response to Hurricane Dorian. I was at NEMA the other day, and I was actually surprised to see that they still have this up. And how did the response take place? Like I said, communication is key. So response operation meetings were held daily at 8 a.m. and at 10 p.m. And what was happening is out of these areas in the black, a list of priorities would drop out. And every day, we would have operation meetings. And these are akin to having daily Scrum stand-up meetings. And every day there would be a set of deliverables that we would have to meet. Getting evacuations done, getting relief and aid to certain portions of the disaster zone, building infrastructure. And each one of the ESFs would report on those daily priorities. And these meetings were facilitated by NEMA, their Emergency Operations Command Center Manager. And that person essentially functions as a Scrum Master, facilitating the meetings and making sure that each ESF has what they need in order to do the work. More importantly, making sure that the communications network that is so important to ensuring that you have an adequate disaster response stayed up. All of the data received from the impacted zones were categorized into one of the ESFs. So the Emergency Operations Center Manager was never inundated with communication. Just as the communication came in, it was passed off to the ESF. If an NGO called and said, hey, I want to send a container of water and humanitarian aid to the Bahamas, then the EOC manager would say, well, you go speak to somebody in ESF 7. And I know 7 because that's logistics and they had a lot of stuff to do. And once it goes to ESF 7, ESF 7 would determine, oh, is that priority against medical supplies? And they did that in their groups. Each ESF had a team of persons working on solutions. Each ESF would determine what resources were needed to attend to issues in the impact zone. And that is akin to sprint planning, as well as determining the priorities. And then the responses were executed. And like it is in real life, some responses were executed very, very well. And some responses were not executed as well as you would have liked for them to be done. And unfortunately, some of the responses weren't executed at all. Either priorities changed or that particular response was no longer necessary. But as things came off the board, the priorities were always updated. And there were always ongoing retrospectives. So after the first month, I started out with this, which is very, very broad. After the first month, these things became very narrow. And we started working on 14-day cycles. And these were, for want of a better word, the sprints between September 30th and October 13th. The priorities were reviewed and things were updated. And this became very, very specific. So for the 81 days that the Emergency Operations Center was in progress, every 2 weeks, we would measure against this baseline. In context, the National Emergency Management Agency provided the infrastructure for the management of data and communication to the various ESFs. NEMA ensured that the emergency support functions had the necessary tools from the government to execute the response. And those tools are national resources, access to the national resources, the emergency resources, policy, that the proper policy framework was in place so that the emergency response can actually take place. You know, at some time, we needed to have curfews. We needed to have special permission for outside security forces. We had tax exemptions for persons wishing to provide aid to the disaster areas. We needed money from the government, money and resources from the government. So the government, as the overall owner of the response, a part of their responsibility was to make sure that NEMA had the appropriate tools. And this communication was in constant contact. We had constant contact. We were updating the government leaders, members of the cabinet on a daily basis. What was working, what changes had to be made to improve the response. So there was always this ongoing dialogue. The Operation and Command Center was up for 81 days approximately. And after that 81 days, NEMA had a comprehensive after-action review. There were intermittent retrospectives, but at the end, there was a huge retrospective with all of the immediate response participants. And everyone and all of the ESFs gave feedback on the success or failures of response activities. After that retrospective, the ESFs were released, and the after action report was completed and distributed, and lessons learned from our approach to Hurricane Dorian, those were collated and documented. Now, of course, you know, Hurricane Dorian was a significant event. Category 5 storm. And in that Category 5 storm, $3 billion worth of economic and physical loss. In the 90 days of the EOC, all of that is not going to be repaired. Response for us was defined as full access. And what that means is on the ground in the disaster areas, you had full access for aid and aid. You had full access for aid and the ability to deliver long-term aid. So the airports were back up within 90 days. The shipping lanes were cleared within 90 days. All of the major roads were cleared within 90 days. You had basic and essential infrastructure and government function on both islands within 90 days. And from that baseline, long-term capital reconstruction projects were organized for predictive and other project lifecycle planning. And in the Bahamas, what they did is, in order to ensure that reconstruction takes place, they established the Disaster Reconstruction Authority that focuses singularly on reconstruction of disaster areas, disaster zones. So where NEMA will focus on planning and mitigation, the Disaster Reconstruction Authority came into force to focus on the long-term reconstruction of a disaster zone. Currently in the Bahamas, there are 3 named disaster zones: Abaco and Grand Bahama as a result of Hurricane Dorian, and Ragged Island as a result of Hurricane Irma. Disaster management requires a dynamic approach because things are changing on the ground so often and so frequently. Your project management approach in a disaster scenario has to be dynamic. An agile approach is, of course, the most feasible approach to disaster management because of the dynamic nature of a disaster. Agile allows for quick response to an ever-changing environment. And you will find that in a disaster scenario, these environments change all of the time. You are always getting new data. There is always something on the ground that may alter a plan. And you have to be able to adapt very, very quickly based on the information that you find out on the ground. When I got the call, and I always, I've shared this, I said this more than once, I always ask myself, how did they even find me? I did not, to be honest with you, in the heat of responding to this disaster, there wasn't a day when I sat down and I went, oh, let me employ agile strategies to respond to Hurricane Dorian. I'd be lying if I said that happened. In real time, what actually happened was I was applying the project management tools that I knew to the event. And it's only in hindsight that I realized that, hey, I was applying agile tools, and the agile tools fit best to this type of response, to this type of event, to this type of project. And in the anatomy of disaster events, what is required is that those agile tools, in my opinion, work best because they allow you the flexibility to respond quickly, to adapt to change, to assess the disaster events. Based on the after action report, one of the key recommendations is that we continue to strengthen the project management capacities of the disaster managers in the country. And we have some very, very strong disaster managers. They have not been, and this is something that I've taken upon myself to ensure that they understand what they're doing from a project management perspective. I was fortunate enough to know where the tools are. Some are unfortunate to realize that they're actually using the tools. But I will tell you, if you look at the little inset on this slide, and if you look at the background, that is a picture of the same place. The little inset is in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Dorian. The background is that same place as it is today. And the reason that contrast has been able to take place is because when all is said and done, Agile actually works. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clarke, for a great presentation. Do we have any questions from the audience? Don't everybody jump in at one time.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
I have a question too. Can you turn off the kid's toy?
So here's my question. Mr. Clarke, great presentation. I really appreciated it. And my question to you is, how were the meetings structured from the various, not only organizations, but mainly the various organizations when it came to executing this project as it really turned out to be?
Okay, so what would happen in a real sense is you only, because the participants to the response were so many, and when I say so many, we had at one point more than 400 persons, close to 400 persons actively involved in the response. So at the emergency center for the daily meetings, only the managers of the different areas were allowed at the emergency operations center. And the number of managers for each ESF was 2. So essentially, in the emergency operation meetings, there were 28 plus the emergency coordinator, the manager of the EOC. So essentially 30 people was in that meeting. Now, each one of the ESFs, the emergency support functions, they had other meetings where they would take the information from the main meeting and go to other meetings, and those meetings were actually held at a convention center. So for example, a ESF could have like shelter and humanitarian aid. They could have maybe as many as 20 or 30 individual team members attached to that ESF, but they would have their meetings, and we actually rented the National Training Agency for all of the non-governmental, the NGOs, and the persons that came in, the volunteers that came in. They did not meet at the NEMA headquarters. They actually met at a convention center. And each one of them, because the center was so big, each one of the ESFs essentially had an office at that center. So they would take from the main group, go into their subgroups, discuss the priorities, strategize the priorities, organize and plan and execute, and come back and report. And if those priorities needed to change, or if they needed additional resources from the national government, they would bring that information and any communication they got from off the ground to the main meeting. It was, you know, it was interesting. We were able to just walk them through the emergency command center and they just got overwhelmed. But the operation actually, and that's only in New Providence. On the islands themselves, originally, we had lost complete government function on both islands. So the first order of business was to actually establish 2 sub-emergency command operations on the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama. And you would be like, well, weren't managers trained on those islands? And the answer was yes, but on those 2 particular islands, our emergency support personnel, all of them were impacted by the storm. They were impacted by the storm. And because they were impacted by the storm, you can't expect a man to come to work and his children he's lost his house. He's at risk. And we had emergency managers that on both islands that pretty much lost everything. They too were traumatized.
Okay, thanks for that response. We have a statement and a question in the chat from David. David, do you want to unmute and ask your question and give your statement, or would you like me to read it out the chat?
I can say it. Yeah, I was just congratulating you on a great story, and it was very well told. And I thought it was really interesting that as a waterfall-oriented person, you could make an agile choice that you're going to employ agile for a period of time. And, you know, you could fit into that and appreciate the benefits of it. I think it's one of the genius things about good project management is selecting the right tool for the context. So that's really well done. The question I had was, did it stay the right tool for the changing context after the initial period was over? Did the group revert to waterfall management for the 2 to 5 year redevelopment project?
Most of our projects now are predictive, are waterfall, because a lot of them are capital-based projects, and a lot of them follow a predictive model. And that's how it is with capital works generally globally. You know, they may have short, agile elements, but by and large, you know, those are predictive.
Does anyone else have a question? We have 10 more minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Clarke. My name is Jackie. I'm with the Bahamas Red Cross, and I'm the PMER officer. And just definitely want to thank you for the information, but so much things were going through my mind as it relates to the EOC. We are presently in the process of establishing an EOC command center here at the Red Cross.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I wanted to ask you is in relation to Hurricane Dorian. I'm new to the Agile and project management community, so a lot of the terms I'm not too familiar with. But I do want to ask you as it relates to the decision making. I know from experience what it is to have 30, 40 people in a room where it seems to be total chaos. But how do you make a decision on who has the final say? And how do you go to the next step?
Okay, so one of our requirements, and that's a very, very good question, Jackie. One of the recommendations out of the after action report, and this was one of the weaknesses in the EOC in Hurricane Dorian, was that the ultimate decision maker was not often in the EOC. And you would have an emergency pop up, say it's an infrastructure somebody, and the person in the EOC has to call a director or a minister, somebody 2 o'clock in the morning. And of course, I mean, you know, nobody's going to pick up the phone, or if you pick up the phone 2 o'clock in the morning, or you're trying to call that person, they're not going to answer the phone. So that something critical has to wait till 9, 10 o'clock, and you've lost in an emergency situation 6, 7, 8 hours, which is really no good. So what we've gone to now and what we've decided is that if you are sitting in the EOC, and we actually tell the agencies, do not put anybody in that room that cannot make a decision on behalf of your agency. That is critical. That is absolutely critical. And that's what you want. You want the person in the room that can give a definitive answer in the response. Apart from that, I mean, what's the point? The EOC should represent the end of the line communication that a decision could be made. NEMA does not make those decisions. So Captain Russell, who's the head of NEMA in the Bahamas, he's not deciding every single thing that happens in the response. If it's a social services question, the people from social services provide that response. If it's a housing, the function of NEMA is to make sure that those responses are given. This is why it is so important that in the EOC, you have persons that can that can make that decision.
I do have another quick question as it relates to the after action review. And you mentioned that I am from Grand Bahama. I went through Dorian and I relocated to Nassau about 10 days after and started volunteering with the Red Cross. Long story short, they hired me. But
Jackie,
yes,
if you look at your participants, you will see a Wendell grant. You should
yes.
you should get to know, well, you should know Wendell. Get to know him. That's the director of the DRA projects.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
My question is, because you mentioned that a lot of there were persons from Abaco and Grand Bahama that were personally affected, and I know that firsthand. But from your after action review, what steps would be made in the future of how to deal with a situation where you have individuals, and we know individuals are impacted, and their concern is their family, but yet they have a job and a responsibility to now provide, information and to provide services and expertise in the midst of this disaster. What are some of your recommendations?
There were two things that were recommended and that are supposed to be enacted now for disaster response. There's always supposed to be a floating EOC team. And the purpose of that team is in the event that we lose government function, we can draw from another set of trained disaster managers to go to that area. So, for example, how Abaco and Grand Bahama were impacted the last time. The idea is each island would have like a buddy. So if Abaco goes down, we get a team from Exuma to go. And we started that planning in a real way. We got the RVs that are supposed to be outfitted for rapid response. The domes in the country, those are supposed to be quick shelters. So all of these things have been the framework for a new level of disaster response we've started to put in at NEMA and the whole disaster management infrastructure throughout the country. So that in the event that it happens again, we know that we can draw on managers. And then what we want to do is we want to make sure that there's cross-functional training in all of the disaster management agencies so that anyone can go and set up an EOC, that we have more hands to do that in the future.
Thank you very much.
Do we have any more questions? We have 3 minutes remaining in our session.
Yes, hi. So thank you for taking my question. You talked about how NEMA setup is based on FEMA. So are you basing a lot of the processes you use on NIMS, National Incident Management System?
I am not 100%.
Okay. The reason I ask is based on what you were when your slide where you talked about response management, talking about your response operation meetings and stuff like that when you have them twice a day. Like those follow NIMS, and the reason I ask is, having survived many hurricanes myself and similar disasters, I recognize how although a lot of these practices that are based on NIMS, which is ultimately what creates FEMA, are excellent practices, but they're very difficult regardless of whether they're agile or plan-based sequential management, waterfall you prefer. But they really do struggle because you're relying on people, and being that these are government bodies, these are elected officials and appointees, and they don't necessarily get along during an activation or an incident. And I was just kind of curious, with your after this is a long-winded question, basically getting to the point now, of when you get to your after action reviews, do you go back and update any of your plans to make them more iterative in response?
For sure. So we had the after action report. And then we had a series of intergovernmental agency meetings with the persons from the after action report. And then we had specific, and those are still ongoing, specific ESF meetings based on the after action report, all in an event, all in an attempt to make sure that some improvement takes place. Now, I'm going to tell you, given the cycle that, you want to focus on the after action things, then you got to prepare for a new hurricane cycle, things invariably get lost. So you have to be in a vulnerable environment. Somebody has to be the marshal to make sure that you don't lose sight of things that will cause your response to improve. I will tell you that one of the US generals visited us right after the storm. And he said the most important thing to me that I'll never forget. And this is for you, Brianna. He came and he said, in all the chaos, he says, look, I want you to remember one thing. If it went smoothly, it wouldn't be a disaster.
No, understood. And you've highlighted plans take a long time. They can take 3 to 5 years to update. And if you get your parliamentary system to vote on it and approve it, it's an exhaustive process. Yeah. And also, like in a disaster, also when you need Parliament to vote on allowing funds to be released, and they're not picking up the phone, and you need a quorum to get just to agree on a basic amount of need. Yeah, I'm just curious if all of this eventually ends up getting into the process. Like, you don't need all of Parliament to vote. You just need a handful of people to be involved, because like you said, getting people in the EOC is exhaustive. And especially if you have a 90-day operation, yeah, that's a long-term.
I think the government has done, and they've tried, successive 8 governments have tried to empower the agencies so that things happen more quickly. The formation of the Disaster Reconstruction Authority is one example of that. And the commitment to fix disaster managers in the agencies, that's another sign of that commitment. And you know, disasters are party neutral. You know, everybody's impacted, and that's something that we've gotten the buy-in from all of the political players. So the idea is that, and Bahamians have a certain resilience, and they're used to doing things relatively quickly on their own. So the whole idea is, and this is where we're at, is that, you know, there is a commitment to empower the agencies to move in a response very, very quickly. And they've been, for by and large, very, very committed to that. Okay,
thank you everyone for your questions. We are at the top of our hour. Thank you, Mr. John Michael Clarke, for an amazing presentation. For those of you who are in attendance, we appreciate you being here. For those who missed out on this live session, the session will be recorded and uploaded to the Access Agile website at a future date for you to access if you want to go back and rewatch. And we're also going to try to get John Michael's slides available as well, because I'm sure he has about 10 more slides he didn't get through.
Oh.
So we're going to have those available. And we thank you so much for attending. This is the Bahamas' first event on the Access Agile Festival calendar. We have 3 more events tomorrow. Be sure to check those out. And we have our event, another event on Saturday, which will feature our youngest presenter at this festival, my 10-year-old daughter. She is going to be talking about Agile and education and how she's using Trello and Scrum to advance her homeschooling. So that's coming up on Saturday. Hope you guys check out our events, and thank you so much for being here and for following our code of conduct. We appreciate you very much. And we're gonna say, welcome to the islands of the Bahamas. We appreciate you very much, and we look forward to some of you joining us in person very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.